pounds in a false panel. And from the back of the false panel, later on, we were able to see how much had been there, because every time money was removed on behalf of Hickson, Horsley marked it up. And at the end of the day, when you counted it up and added it to 279 odd thousand, you reached a total of nearly 400,000.
But the detectives' hopes of turning Horsley into a supergrass were dashed. Within hours of his arrest, his family was approached by someone who suggested that it would be in Horsley's best interests to say nothing else about the robbery. The following morning, Horsley terminated the interview and was charged with handling proceeds from the robbery. But John Horsley had said enough to incriminate John Knight, who owned a garage in Southgate, Billy Hickson and Terence Perkins, and the flying squad obtained access to their bank and building society accounts.
Although this inquiry actually started off as an armed robbery, as it went on, it became more like a fraud inquiry with the financial evidence that we were looking into.
It was evidence like this which detectives found when they visited John Knight's home on the 22nd of January 1984.
The main thing we found was a long list of building societies, various branches throughout North London, showing the amounts that he had obviously deposited in there. He was in fact making deposits of about £10,000 on each visit to the building societies. And in fact, I recall that one cashier told us that when he handed in £10,000, after she had counted it, she found that there was £100 over. She explained it to him, and he just pushed it back and said, "You better have that as a tip."
There you go. And another £1 million form.
So kind.
So much money was involved that the gang had hired vans to move it around. Police checked every single van hire agreement for April 1983.
Whoa! Hold that order, it might be time for the champagne. Look. A white van hired to M&M garages.
We were aware through Horsley of a white hire van being at the scene, dropping some monies and then collecting some. Two officers travelled around North London making inquiries of all hiring agencies, and they came up with this white van which had been hired on the 6th of April. It had been hired by M&M Garage and signed for by Alan Opiola.
Police knew John Knight was a part owner of the M&M Garage with Alan Opiola. Opiola was brought in for questioning. He was shocked to discover that the flying squad knew he'd hired a white van, and that they also knew it had been used to transfer some of the stolen money.
What's going to happen now?
That, Alan, is largely up to you. What I know is that you're a key suspect in a £6 million robbery. And if you go down for that, you won't see North London again until the end of the century. Think of your wife. Think of your family. How are they going to cope?
That night, Opiola agreed to become a supergrass. The following day, his wife Linda did likewise.
Anyway, so about 2 days after the robbery, Terence Perkins and John Knight came to the garage, asked me if I'd hire a van for them. Then they asked me if they could use the house to count the money. You ever seen what £2 million looks like, eh?
When Linda and Alan Opiola decided to give Queen's evidence, we placed Linda Opiola together with her mother-in-law and her young daughter in a secure premises. And at that time we had a 24-hour armed guard on her. We felt this was important at that time because the threat against Linda and her family was quite real.
Threatening calls were made by Jimmy Knight, one of John Knight's brothers, to Linda Opiola. He warned her and her husband not to talk to the police.
When we went to James Knight's place, it's quite a large building in 22 acres. The property was searched and near enough £20,000 was recovered.
Jimmy Knight was also charged with the robbery, but the flying squad was convinced that at least 6 others were involved. The question was, who were they? The answer lay behind the walls of Jimmy Knight's scrapyard in East London.
Ian Malone, he was attached to the drug squad after hearing who we'd arrested, informed us that he actually turned the place over on a search warrant, James Knight's scrapyard in Dalston. This was some 3 weeks prior to the robbery. Present were 6 men: James Knight, John Knight, Terence Perkins, Billy Hickson. And he also mentioned that 2 other men, Ronnie Everett and John Mason, were also present.
Flying squad detectives arrested Mason and Everett, and their bank and building society accounts were closely examined. But there was no evidence to link them to the robbery, and they were released. A few weeks later, both men had left England for a new life abroad. But they weren't alone. Within 24 hours of John Knight's arrest, 2 other men had already fled to Spain. They were another Knight brother, Ronnie, and the former Cray twins henchman, Freddie Foreman. Another man, known to the police, was already there, Clifford Sachs, a London publican who'd moved to Fuengirola in December 1983, having sold his pub, The Fox, in Hackney, shortly after the Security Express robbery. The first Security Express trial ended on the 7th of June 1985. John Knight was sentenced to 22 years for robbery, while Jimmy Knight got 8 years after being found guilty of handling some of the stolen money. Billy Hickson got 6 years also for handling. Terence Perkins pleaded not guilty to robbery, but was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 22 years. John Horsley admitted robbery and got 8 years. Alan Opiola, the prosecution's chief witness, admitted handling some of the money and received a 3.5-year prison sentence. After the break, the Spanish connection, suspects on the run, and how justice caught up with them. With the first trial over, detectives switched their attention to the group of London villains who'd moved to Spain in the preceding months.
Officers from the inquiry went to Spain in June of 1984 to make inquiries about John Knight and properties that he was purchasing over there. And they became aware of other people from London who had suddenly arrived in the Costa del Sol the previous year and had started spending large amounts of money and purchasing properties.
John Mason and Ronnie Everett had already been questioned about their role in the robbery. They'd been released on police bail, but decided to flee to Spain, where they bought a number of luxury apartments in this exclusive block in Marbella. In 1984, the flying squad discovered that they shared a safety deposit box at this Spanish bank.
We went to a local magistrate's court to apply for a search warrant. It took us several hours. When we got back to the bank and opened up the boxes, they were completely empty. We were absolutely gutted. But when we established from the bank records, we discovered that Everett and Mason had been in the interim period and obviously emptied it.
Freddie Foreman was the third suspect police wanted to question about the robbery, after he also bought property in this block in Spain. At the time of the Security Express job, he and his wife Maureen's joint account contained just £72.69. They also couldn't afford the rent on their flat in Bermondsey.
By April of 1983, he was receiving assistance from the local council to pay for his council flat. He was having difficulties there financially. His bank account wasn't all that clever. And then all of a sudden, by June, he was spending £76,000 buying a nice house in Marbella. And then by August, he'd spent another £100,000 buying 3 flats in the same luxury complex. So the money had to come from somewhere.
Following the robbery, Foreman made a series of cash deposits at the Allied Irish Bank in Lewisham. In May, he deposited £20,000. The following month, £114,500 went into his account, and in July, he deposited just under £250,000. By November 1983, £363,280 had been deposited in the account. Later that year, he invested much of the money in this bar in the hills above Marbella. Clifford Sachs was another robbery suspect police were keen to question. Like the others, the former pub landlord had bought property in Spain shortly after the robbery. He paid cash for 2 villas next door to each other. One he lived in with his wife Vera, the other he rented out.
He in fact was the licensee of the Fox public house, and soon after the robbery he in fact started to go into the process of selling it, and we discovered that he was in fact buying villas in Spain which came to a total of over £100,000. And when we made our inquiries at the public house about the sale, we discovered that he probably only got about £10,000 for it. So there was an enormous difference from what he was selling the pub for and what he was buying the villas in Spain for.
Detectives had discovered